Go. All right. Amazing. Thank you so much, Ben, for sitting down with me to chat on the podcast. I'm super excited for today's topic. And yeah, I'm excited to dive in with you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. So, for my audience that doesn't know who you are, just let's tell them who you are, where you're from, and what were you like as a child, and really what was your journey growing up?
hmm Okay, so I founded an organization in 2007, 2008 called Exodus Cry to combat the global injustice of human trafficking. Um, so that's what I'm giving my life to, and there's also a strong emphasis on the filmmaking aspect of how we combat this issue. And so maybe we can get into that more. Growing up, I grew up in Southern California. I was the youngest of four kids, so I felt growing up like my childhood was idyllic. I grew up with just going to the beach and having tons of space to roam, to explore, to be a young boy, ride motorcycles, surf, all those things that boys love to do growing up. And but I was fairly sheltered, again, being the youngest of four children. And when I was 11, I saw a movie called The Accused that was it was about the gang rape of a woman named Cheryl Arroyo. And it was a true story. And anyways, the scene that depicted this gang rape, I had no idea what I was doing watching this movie at 11 years old. But anyhow, it was seeing that movie is really what awakened me to the presence of evil in the world. And I was, I felt like in many ways I was raised by women because I had two older sisters. My parents had gotten divorced. So I lived with my mom, and then my grandma was, probably the biggest influence in my life. And so, being awakened to the presence of evil in our world in context to um, a scene that depicted the gang rape of a woman, there was something at that young age that I think was deposited into me. And in terms of an identification with the suffering of women. And, but I at that age, I mean, I was like, what, is this like the first time that this has ever happened? I had
Yeah.
no knowledge of how widespread this, was. And um, so later in life, when I found out about the issue of human trafficking for the first time, uh, the way that I describe my encounter and awakening to the issue of human trafficking is that the feelings that haunted me from that age of 11 concerning the awful injustice that could be perpetrated against a woman like that, um, all all that emotion, I think, that was like in my body, like came out. And I was overwhelmed with grief in a way that uh, my heart was pierced with this injustice of human trafficking and sex trafficking in particular. And so the only thing I knew to do at that time was to carry this burden before God in prayer. And 2 days later, I was a part of a worship team at the International House of Prayer. And Misty Edwards was the worship leader at that time. And we had a debriefing before this prayer meeting. And I told the team about this issue that I had just discovered myself. Now I was the expert on it 2 days later. And and so that night we went out, we prayed. There was about 500 people in the room, and it just, the burden of the Lord for this issue, I think, was just deposited in the entire room. And we labored in intercession for 2 hours. And the next day there was one of the largest trafficking busts in history. And we felt like that was an exclamation point of God's zeal for this issue. And so that was the launching point for us to dive into this issue. Again, not knowing what the journey would look like, not even fully understanding the issue, but just, yeah, being introduced to it, and then beginning a path towards combating it.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I was listening, obviously, to the podcast that you were in, the Nation's podcast, and there were so many stories. I mean, I've literally wept all day just listening to these stories, and
Oh, wow.
obviously watching the film and then listening to the podcast. But there was one that really like touched me. Was, I mean, there were several, but I'll just name a few. The one that you told me about, the girl that was your friend, that she, told you about her anniversary and she told you
Oh,
happy
yeah, yeah, yeah.
birthday. And
Mhm.
could you
Yeah,
share that story? And
yeah,
I'll mention a couple of them just because I want my audience to hear those stories, but that's one that I would love for you to share.
yeah. I'll share a couple stories that I
Yeah.
think help give context to my own kind of like personal journey into this issue, and also the way in which I believe that God is awakening people to this injustice, because He has a fierce uh, um, jealousy for over the lives of people in our world that are being exploited. And um, and I truly believe that He invites us to partner with Him in being His hands and feet in the world to bring about justice for the oppressed. And I know that much of Christianity comes with a lot of baggage, has been maligned in many ways and misrepresented, but there is a very core message in the Bible that Jesus Himself proclaims as part of His mission statement when He begins His public ministry. And He said, I have been anointed. And at that point you go, okay, for what? And it could have been like, I am anointed to, you know, uh, to explain all the political and religious debates of the day, to tell people how to get to heaven, to, you think of all these things that He could say. But He says, I've been anointed to bring deliverance to the captives and heal the brokenhearted. And so there's this very central idea in Scripture of a God, Jesus, understands that our world is broken, understands that our world is hurting, and He goes, it's okay, you're broken. I've been anointed to come and bring healing and deliverance. And so that is kind of the for us, like a very core conviction that I think really compels and motivates the work that we do. But this first story that I want to share is one that is obviously very personal for me, but again, I think it issues forth something for the world, like for people to understand that God is calling forth a movement of abolition to come against the systems of oppression that seek to devour and exploit human life. And there's something that this guy Albert Schweitzer said. He said, okay, he said, I got to get this quote right. This is really good.
Yeah, take your
Um,
time.
um, the tragedy of life is what dies inside a man while he lives. And a man, a woman, whatever it is. And for us, like, that is, I think, one of the biggest realms of injustice, of heartbreak, of grief that we have been stricken with related to this issue, is seeing in the eyes and in the lives of people that it's not just that they've been taken or oppressed or exploited, it's that they've been exploited to a point where the inner man dies, and you actually see that despair in their eyes. And so the good news is God is calling forth a movement of abolition to fight for the bodies and the souls and the freedom and deliverance and healing of these people. So what happens is, February 3rd, 2007, I find out about this issue of human trafficking. later, I had gone up to a church in Northern California to do some teaching and on this issue, and we were meeting together with a group of their leaders, and it was the first day of meetings. I just gotten in, I sit down, there's another survivor of human trafficking who had become a friend of mine. She's there, and it's her birthday, so I say to her happy birthday and all that, and but her response caught me off guard. She said happy birthday to you, and I was like, oh, no, my birthday's in November, like,
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm November 12th. And so she goes, no. She goes, today is your birthday of when you first found out about human trafficking. I go, wait a minute, today's February 3rd. I go, oh, yeah, you're right. It is, that I go, wow, that's so strange. That's, I go, but how did you know that? And she goes, no, she goes, I never forgot it. She goes, because I heard you say it in a message once. And she goes, it always stuck with me. She goes, because in February 3rd, 2007, I was in prison because I wouldn't testify against my trafficker. She goes, because I was afraid that he would kill my son if I testified against him. So she's doing prison time, having been involved in this trafficking ring and being prostituted out against her will. She goes, on that day, February 3rd, 2007, I was in prison. She goes, and I got down on my knees and I prayed that God would raise somebody up who would expose what's really going on with this injustice of human trafficking. I'm like, wait a minute. I go, my head was just like, I'm like, what meaneth thou this?
Is it I? Is it I?
It's one of those very strange things in life where when you begin to just say yes to God in the simplicity of, those small choices, and you don't think much of it. And oftentimes, I don't know about you, but I find myself relating to God as though he were a deist God, as though he were distant in the cosmos. So he's not really concerned with the intimate details of my life. But moments like that just bring everything into synchronicity, where I'm like, whoa, I was just, bumbling about, my normal, like, the old me, like, is doing my life. And thinking on, in my weakness and brokenness, trying to say yes and trying to say here and there. And then all of a sudden there's these moments of convergence where the whole providential picture opens up and we can see, like, whoa, like, it's like it says in Ephesians 2, where it says we are God's workmanship. And that word workmanship is poema in the Greek, and it means poem. And it illuminates this idea that as we say yes to God, that his hands, he is forming and fashioning and shaping our lives for a purpose.
Yes.
And just that picture of the potter shaping the clay. And it was one of those moments for me where I go, okay, so you're in prison. Let me get this straight. I go, you're in prison because you won't testify against your trafficking. You get on your knees, you pray that as your gift that year, God would raise somebody up who would expose this evil injustice of human trafficking. She goes, yeah. I go, okay, so February 3rd, 2007, I'm out bumbling about, and somebody begins to share with me this whole issue of human trafficking that becomes the catalyst to launch it. It just blew my mind. But in that was such a, I found out about this years later, and it's interesting how God will sow a seed into our life and then allow it to be tested in the wilderness before going, no, it was me all along. And so it was all these years later, and then, it's like God like winks at me like, no, you have been in the center of my will. And so there's this but I feel like it issued forth a resonance of a calling that God is commissioning right now in this hour. Human trafficking is one of the three major forces of evil currently holding the planet hostage. And so while this story is very personal to me, I think it speaks to what God is doing globally around the world. And he's inviting many people into this to become modern day abolitionists and to embrace that mantle of, of Wilberforce, that mantle of abolition, the mantle of Isaiah 61 and Luke 4:18, that idea of being anointed to set the captives free and heal the brokenhearted and open prison doors. And so I have found myself kind of, immersed into the swirl of that. And there's times and seasons where we're in the trenches and we're just on the front lines, and it's, 3 years will go by and it's just like, boom. And then there's times where we step back and kind of like recalibrate and go, okay, like what, so I enjoy doing these podcasts because it's great for me sometimes to pull back and just look at that big picture and realize, what God is doing in this hour.
Right. Oh my God. Yes. And you speak so poetically, and it's so awesome when you speak with people who have passion, who have purpose, who have like God's hand over life. Obviously, I believe everybody has God's hand over their life, but I don't think that everybody's open to hearing his voice. And sometimes I'll say, like, I definitely have a lot of friends that are open to their voice and we can have conversations like this, but there's some people that I feel like are a little bit more on the surface level, and I can't really go that deep with them or have that conversation with them about God's voice. And I always pray to God to send me those people, right? Like those people who are attuned to his voice. And in my family, I'll say that I don't really feel like I have many people that are attuned to that voice. So when I first started walking in my faith, which is interesting, because it's interesting because I've been a victim of both like child abuse and like sexual abuse, but the child abuse was with obviously my mom and my stepdad, right? Like they physically abused me as a child. Like, like normal hitting is normal, but now as an adult looking back, you can see where it's like it wasn't normal. Like it wasn't normal, the excessive punishment, the excessive mental games that they would play with us. Just the way that they treated us was very wrong. And my mom has since then, especially I think because I speak about it so openly, even to her face, where it's like, yeah, we were abused, like I've forgiven her, but I do speak about it. And when I first spoke about it, it was a lot of shame, like how dare I say that. And obviously as an actress, I've used it in my plays and, in my podcasts or in my YouTube, I've just shared, this experience that I've had as a child. And I think really, you never really allow yourself to, it's not about like because I don't want to be a victim of things that have happened to me in the past, but it is something that has happened. And I don't know, watching the film and then going back to how it's like, I had an incident where a friend that, just like violated my trust. And, when you watch a film like yours, it almost makes you feel like, well, I didn't have it that bad. You know what I mean? So maybe I wasn't abused that bad, or maybe because you start to kind of think, well, wow, it could have been way worse. You know what I mean? Like you start, and since mine was a child abuse, I was like, well, I'm so glad I didn't have to deal with that as an adult. Like my imprisonment was like as a kid. And in your film, when at the end, when they talk about how Jesus came to them in dreams, and I didn't grow up with God or anything like that. I mean, my dad was Catholic and my grandmother was Catholic, and they slowly sowed a couple of seeds in there, and I did communion and stuff. But when I was called, when God came to me, I'll say like when I was walking through a lot when I was a child, like, I would say like, obviously like both my mom and my stepdad were very abusive, but they did this one specific punishment where for some reason the punishment that they decided to do was to cut all my hair off. And because they said that the only way that they could get me to change was if they broke me where it hurt. If they cut my hair off, if they took my hygiene, if they took everything of mine and they put it in a box, and just the things that they would do to me, you know what I mean? And the words that they would say, and the physical, like how they would hit me, and I don't know, I kind of lost my train of thought, but so I remember when I was walking through that, they had cut my hair, and I think my hair and my beauty has always been a part of me, because I think it's as a woman, it's one of your powers,
Mm.
to feel beautiful.
Mhm.
And I remember looking myself in the mirror, and I had a walk-in mirror I'm in a walk-in closet when I was a little girl, and I closed myself in the door, and I was broken. I was broken because I never felt safe. I was being broken by the two people that are supposed to love you. And, my dad wasn't nearby, because my dad was, I would say, more of a, I don't want to say the word coward, because that's a really mean word, but my dad just, he didn't know how to be there for us. You know what I mean? Because our divorce was so bad. My mom and my dad's divorce was so bad that he really just couldn't do anything. And I really needed him. I really needed him, because I was facing these two big giants as a little girl. And I remember looking myself in the mirror, and a voice came to me, and it was like, have joy. It's something they can never take from you.
Mm.
And I remember leaving that closet and just having this utmost joy come upon my life. And I
Mm.
remember just skipping and dancing and just throwing myself into escapism of artistry, of just saying, I'm going to be an actress, and I love singing and I love dancing. And it was this joy that was festering in my soul. And I remember my stepdad saying to me, oh, you seem so happy, maybe we should cut your hair shorter.
Mm.
And and it's so hard, because as an adult, I've have so many of those traumas that still like live inside of me, and I have to be around this human, this person that was, in my eyes, my abuser.
Mm.
And my family doesn't understand why I don't want to have a relationship with him. And
Mm.
I'm like, I don't think you guys understand that as a little girl, this person was my abuser. And it's really
Mm.
hard to say that when your sister, that's her dad, or that's your mother's husband, or that's people's family member that you can't, you can't say that. But it's
Mm.
my story, and I get to say it, and I don't think that anyone should ever take that away from you. And I just think that it is amazing how like God does come to your life, and he just completely takes you on a journey. And I remember him coming to me in dreams, and just, I had a dream where I was in a burning building, and he came to me in like this magic carpet ride, and he would talk to me. And now I feel like, for a long time, just saying that I was Christian, or going to a church and throwing my hands in the air and worshiping, like that was so weird for me, because I felt like, is this cultish? Like, what is this thing? Like, what is this church thing? And then getting made fun of by my family, like, oh, Liz is a Christian now. Do you think everyone's going to hell, Liz, because, you believe in God? Or, sending somebody a sermon, and then they're being like, oh, I just don't want to hear it because it's too much Jesus. And I'm like, but the message is what I want you to hear. Like the message of why this pastor's talking about what a secure woman looks like. That's what I want you to hear, not
Mm.
the story that he's saying about Ruth. And like that's fine. Like, don't look at the biblical,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
scripture if that freaks you
Yeah.
out, but it's the
Yeah.
message, and I don't know. I don't know why I felt like sharing that.
Well, I think, no, thank you. Thank you for sharing a bit of your own personal story. And I mean, first of all, I'm very sorry for, yeah, what you went through
Yeah.
and endured and experienced as a child, just that betrayal of your innocence as a child. And I think the offloaded shame and self-hatred and existential anguish of your own parents suffering onto you. Um, you did not deserve that, and that was not yours to carry. And as a child, I think you don't even have the cognitive capacities to avoid internalizing that. And so it's a very, I think, common experience for people who have experienced those types of abuses to have to begin to unpack later in life the shame and the powerlessness that comes from an experience like that. And yeah, there's a unique shame and powerlessness, I think, that comes from child abuse. And so yeah, I appreciate you
Yeah.
sharing that. And I was going to say something about it, but I kind of lost my train of thought
No.
while I was going. But Yeah, I think having just seen Nefarious, I know you just
Yeah.
watched that
Yes.
documentary Nefarious. I think that it's, it puts you in proximity. There's a quote that I heard once that says that there are two things that pierce the human heart: tragedy and beauty. And Nefarious really captures both of those realities in a palpable way, and also in a way that causes us to self-reflect on our own life and journey, and in kind of like a grasping for answers, like wow, like because it unlocks the heart.
Yeah.
And for those of us that have experienced trauma and abuse and exploitation and those feelings of shame and powerlessness and abuse, um, I think that there does come a question of, is God real, and
Right.
is he good? And 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 so I think it's natural for us uh, to wrestle with that in relationship to the suffering in our world, to the brokenness in our world, and to understand, like, God, where are you in this? Faith is not a uh, it's not a kind of black or white thing. I think it's something that is, you know, is a spectrum. People experience faith on a spectrum, and I think we all, as humans, struggle to understand our existence, and I'm thankful for those interventions of God in my life that have instilled in me a deep faith and trust and hope, because I don't think I would be able to face the injustice of human trafficking and even situations like what you experienced without that hope. And just recently, this past week, I was listening to an old sermon from the pastor that I grew up, you know, going to church and as a kid, and Pastor Chuck Smith at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, and he was literally days before he was had stage 4 cancer, was in the final stages of cancer, and he gave this message days before he died. And um, and he tells the story, and is the only time I've ever heard him. And he was a pastor for like 60 years or longer, like 65 years. Like he was a oak of righteousness and just a pillar, and in the faith. And I'd never ever seen him get emotional, but he tells this story, and he talks about how his brother Paul had asthma, and when he was a child, he had this memory of his mom rocking Paul when he would have these asthma attacks at night, and just singing this chorus over him, "Jesus never fails." And he's telling this story, and he's getting like real emotional. And again, like, he's got stage 4 cancer, and he's saying this, and I'm like, only somebody who has lived a life like Chuck has could have stage 4 cancer and be sharing such a beautiful story about God's faithfulness. And so he tells the story. His mom is holding his brother, and he says it just meant this memory of her singing this chorus over him, "Jesus never fails," over and over, all through my childhood. So when she passed away, he said, I uh, he said, "I had written on her tombstone the phrase, 'Jesus never fails.'" He said, "But then," he said, "sometime after my mother passed away, I was in the area where my grandma had lived, and I went to visit my grandmother's tombstone, and written on her tombstone was the phrase, 'Jesus never fails.'" And just
Amazing.
stuff like that just inspires my faith to know that amidst all this suffering and all this injustice, there's a temptation to buy into the lie that is really the accuser, the spirit of darkness that accuses God, that says he's not good, he's not trustworthy, and just do it your own way. And I think that lie is at the heart of our culture today, and it is there's a question mark about where is God in the midst of this suffering. But in my experiences, we have gone out and um, and met the survivors of human trafficking. Uh, I would say, I mean, I can't think of one that hasn't had some profound supernatural experience in which Jesus visited them and encountered them in the midst of their suffering. And there was a dream that this young woman had, Jennifer Toledo, and it was a experience. It was a vision. She said, you know, like the Apostle Paul when he says, like, whether I was in the body or out of the body, I do not know, but I was in the other place, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like I was taken up, and she's in this heavenly mansion, and she said that it was very metaphorical. Like there was a room where there was like the spiritual library, and people were filling their minds with the knowledge of God, and there was a wine cellar, and people were becoming intoxicated in the presence of God. And she said there was all these different rooms. She said, but then we went into Jesus was giving her a guided tour of this father's house. And she said, and we went into the room called the intimacy chamber. And she said it was the most beautiful, ornate room of the entire house. And she said, but off in the corner, there was this wooden hatched doorway, and it looked very unbecoming in this really ornate room. And she said that her curiosity was awakened, and she said, you know, what's in that room? And Jesus said, oh, he said, well, that's the room where I spend most of my time. And he said, but not many people will go in that room. And she said, you know, at that point she was curious to know, like, well, what's in it? And so she asks him, can you take me into this other room? So he said, yes, but you have to get very low to get through the door. So he opens this wooden hatched doorway. They climb down a spiral staircase to a small room. And she said, it was just a small room with windows all around and a single chair. And she goes, as we came down into this room, Jesus said, he said, this is where I spend most of my time. This room is called the weeping room. And she said, as you looked out these windows, she said, you could see every injustice. You could hear the groaning of the prisoner. You could hear the screams of those who were being raped. She said, you could hear and see every injustice all at once. And she said, this beautiful king took his seat in that chair. And she said, he began to weep. And she said, he stayed there for hours and hours and hours. She said, I couldn't even remember how long the time we were there in that room for. She said, but I began to weep. And she said, I wasn't just weeping because of the injustice of things that were being done in the world. She said, but I began to weep because of this beautiful king who would spend his time in that place. And I have come to discover God as a God of deep compassion. And I think it's at the heart of all of this. Compassion, empathy disrupts exploitation. And I think that, you know, the injustice that permeates our world is a lack, from a fundamental lack of empathy. But I have come to encounter God as a God of empathy. So it's experiences like this, you know, that I think for me deeply root and ground me in the mission that we're pursuing, and a faith that when things don't make sense, when I can't wrap my mind around this level of suffering, that I can know that not to lean on my own understanding, but to trust in him. And I've seen him come through time and time and time again in situations where it seemed like, you know, it was hopeless. And so that's the hope for me in all of this. And I think for you, you know, just thinking of your own personal story, it's easy for your faith to be damaged when your innocence has been betrayed by, you know, those that you're supposed to trust. And it's hard to trust again. It's interesting the thing that you said about the joy, because I literally just posted yesterday on Instagram a picture of my son with the caption, "Joy is a guardian of our soul." Yeah. And we need it. We need to to remember joy in the midst of suffering. And so that's why I say, the two things that pierce the human heart, tragedy and beauty. It's like, in as much as it's really important for us to connect with the tragedy and the suffering of our world, and to experience empathy related to that, like to weep in our hearts before we talk with our mouths. And I think it's equally important that we see the beauty of what God is doing in the midst of, in a way that lifts our spirit and guards our soul with joy,
Right.
so that we don't fall into despair.
Yeah. Oh my God, Ben, thank you for that. Wow. I'm just like, I'm so like, I'm just so moved. I'll say, just thank you for that. And
Yeah.
I think I had like so I'm only 25 years old, and I've only been a Christian for like 3 years. I'd say Easter's my anniversary. It's like kind of when I remind myself of when I first started going to church, and when I got baptized again and all of that. And so I think this is my third anniversary of being a Christian. And I always threw myself into service. I would say, I would say I when I first started walking in my faith, and I live in New York, and I go to Hillsong, and I started deciding, like, God was telling me that, he wanted me to rise up as this leader, and that I was going to be doing a lot of things in the church. And like, these are the messages I would hear when I was at church. And he's like, I really want you to start getting into community, Elizabeth. Like, I really want you to start serving. And I was like, okay. And so I decided I was gonna serve with City Hope. And so City Hope, what they are is they're a service team that what they do is they go out into the community and pretty much bring hope, right? And so they did, the first day that I served with them was on a Wednesday, and it's supposed to be the street team. They're supposed to take food to homeless people and kind of just, give them food, give them things that they need, pray over them, and kind of let them know, like, about the shelters and things like that. But this Wednesday in particular was going to be a day where we were just going to play games with like a pretty much like a halfway house kind of thing. And I was like excited. I didn't know what to expect. I just knew that God was telling me, I feel very close to the homeless community in New York. Like, every time I pass them, I always feel like God's telling me, like, one day you're going to help them. I'm not there financially yet. Like, I'm always asking, like, how can I help? Like, how can I help these people? Like, I just, those are the kind of things that keep me up at night. Like, I just want to know, like, if there's houses right now that are vacant, why are there people on the streets? Like, I just don't understand. Like, that's the way my mind works. And so I was like, I just want to, serve these people. And so when I got there, I was really excited. And I think innocently, going into it, I felt like, I'm a light. I can help, I can just talk to people and they're going to feel great. And during prayer, they just told us, we all prayed before going into the room to play games with them. They just told us, be mindful, like, not everybody's going to be happy that you're here, and just kind of giving us this like harsh reality, keep your things close by, things. And so we went in and we started playing, and I got this overwhelming anxiety come over me because I realized how sheltered I am, how privileged I am, that I don't put myself in situations where I don't see these things. And so I started seeing people like, like this one girl that you could tell that she's done crack and she has her pimp here in the halfway house. And you have the people that are like, just like spazzing out because they're not on drugs, or there's just a lot going on. And then you have this one girl that she's just sitting in the back, and I want to talk to her and she doesn't want to talk to me. She's mad that I'm there. And just a bunch of us, like, just Christian people, like, just volunteering, ready to just sit down and play games with you. And I was just trying, I didn't know what to do. And I started looking for my leaders to kind of see, like, what are they doing, because they've done this and they weren't taking it so seriously. And I realized I was trying to make it this mission, and they were just having a good time. So I was like, I can't sit here with the girl that doesn't want to talk to me and try to change her mind and let me get through to her. I have to go be with the people that are open. And just, that's what I started feeling. And I just, at the end of that, like, I started playing, Uno. And then I went and I sat down with this one young man, and we start playing a game, and he starts talking to me, and I just start hearing out a story, and I ask him like, oh, how long have you been in these housings? And he goes, oh, since I was like 7. I was like, 7? He's like, yeah, like I've been in and out, like, my parents like didn't want me, so like I would always come over here, and then I would just start selling drugs. And he starts telling me all these stories about gangs, and how he knows all these stories about gangs and all of this stuff. And I'm just, I'm like, wow, I'm just trying to speak life over him. I'm like, you're so smart. Like, you should take these stories and maybe you can make a film out of it. Or maybe you can, trying to like encourage him with ideas of creativity. And, we just start having a conversation. He tells me, oh yeah, tomorrow's my birthday. And my soul just, like, my heart just like got so tight, because I thought, oh my God, it's your birthday and you're not going to be with your family. Like, I just felt so guilty of how privileged I've been, that my birthdays I get presents and I have all my friends, and like I've had amazing birthdays compared to someone that's like just like in a halfway house. And it just broke my heart. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like, how old are you? And he was my age, and we just had just different lives. And I was like, and then I felt like I should share a little bit of my story. I told her, I was like, I've also been abused or things like that. And I kind of just started sharing, like, I get that. Oh yeah. And he's like, yeah, my parents always would get mad at me. And then I told him, I was like, in the Bible, it says that you should listen to your parents, and and you should honor them. And sometimes, I was like telling him, I know that our parents are trying to tell us this, but it's because they don't want us to hit that wall. And he was telling me he's thinking of maybe go spending time with his grandparents tomorrow, but that they're not happy with him. And I go, why? He's like, oh, they don't like that, I get involved in gangs. And I was like, look, having grandparents is like such a gift, and you never know how long you have them. You should definitely go spend time with people that love you. And you could just tell that he was like, he was getting so emotional, like hearing me talk. And I was telling him, like, I was asking him, like, what's your dream? Like, what do you want to do for the world? Like, and he was like, I don't know, maybe I want to be like a security guard at like a bar or something like that. And I started to try to encourage him of like maybe some other options and things like that. I was like, look, you're very smart. Like, you're this, you're that. Like, and just telling him, like, there's so much you could do for your life. And I told him, look, just because you've been in this situation, just think of like who your kid is going to be, like who your son's going to be. Maybe you can encourage your son, never to walk this path. Or maybe you can start telling other kids that were in your position, like, and I told him I've had cousins that were in gangs and that they've lost their lives. And, I told them, you don't know how maybe you can save some kid's life if you kind of just share your story with them. And you could tell he was being so profoundly touched. And he said to me, damn, Liz, you're cool. Like, I always thought Christians were like uptight and, perfect, but you're changing my mind about Christians. And my heart was just like, I remember feeling so much fear being in this position of thinking I am so out of my comfort zone, because I don't like being in places that I feel like I'm just out of my comfort zone. But I heard God tell me that I was a fighter, and that my job was to now start putting myself on the line, not putting myself on the line where I'm actually going to get hurt, but putting myself out on the line where it's like having these uncomfortable conversations with people. But I'm not radically trying to preach gospel to you. I'm just trying to share light with you and love with you, And I feel like that's so much of what you do. And I saw just the fact that you were like in Cambodia and like Thailand and these places, and putting yourself in these positions where it's like how did you feel when you were just like in Cambodia? Like, how did you feel when you were in these places? And I like love that one scene where you kind of like fight off what are they called? A pedophile. Like, you fought one of those pedophiles. And I was just like, I don't know, like, how did you feel in those situations, and specifically like seeing those pedophiles and all that? Like,
yeah, coming into, a situation like that where you're surrounded by such deep brokenness, and surrounded by people who are in, such dire situations in life, it can, I think for me, I know that that those feeling, I felt powerless in those situations. And And especially, when you're in a country like Cambodia and there's so much corruption, and you're surrounded by a situation where the the exploitation that's happening around you is happening to children. Um, and but I take a lot of courage from a passage in which Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And what I love about this story is that he depicts a story in which there's a person, a lonely traveler, who is beaten, stripped naked, and left for dead. And and then he talks about these two characters that come along this road, and they were the religious leaders of the day, and they were the people who believed all the right things, had the right titles, all of this. And he says they passed by on the other side of the road. And then he says there was this certain Samaritan that came along, and that is the person who was insignificant, lived in the wrong part of town, believed the wrong things, you know, and all of that. And he says this person's coming by. They see the person who's been beaten, stripped naked, and left for dead, and this insignificant nobody who had the wrong doctrine and yada 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 goes to that one. Now, this is extremely offensive in the setting in which Jesus is telling it, because the Jewish people hated Samaritans, and they thought they were, half-breed, nitwit, delusional heretics. And so Jesus is setting up a situation where it's the Samaritan who's going to be the hero of the story. The Samaritan goes to this person who has been beaten, stripped naked, and left for dead. Doesn't preach the gospel, doesn't, jam a bunch of Bible verses down their throat, just goes to them, is present in the midst of their suffering. It actually says, has compassion. Has compassion, this one identifies with the plight of this person who has experienced such tragedy, such injustice, and then ministers to them, pours oil in their wounds, takes this person to an inn, makes sure that they're taken care of. And then Jesus says, which of these stories do you think depicts the second greatest commandment, to love our neighbor as ourselves? And the answer is obvious. It says, so you go and do likewise. What I love about this story is that it takes the pressure off of having some kind of agenda when we go and talk. And for me, and it seems like maybe you felt that way a little bit going into this environment, that I feel like, well, maybe when I go out, I need to get people to believe the right things, or, I've got to have some way to qualify my being in this environment as being ministry, or being a good human. And that story takes the pressure off, and it empowers us to go into these situations and just to be present. And in being present and beginning to identify with the suffering of others, we'll be led to give a person a gift on their birthday when they weren't going to receive one, because they were disconnected from family and friends. Or, in my situation in Cambodia, it was, confronting a pedophile and chasing him out of town. But it will have different manifestations. But we don't have to go in with any other agenda except to love well. And, and sometimes that expression of love looks like just sitting and being present with somebody in their pain. And other times it does look like defending the weak and rebuking the oppressor, so to speak. And I remember when I went undercover into the porn industry for a year to film a new documentary that's coming out this year, a docuseries that we did called Beyond Fantasy.
Oh my God, I'm so excited.
Yeah. And I interviewed this one young woman who was 18 years old. She had just joined the porn industry, had been in for several months, and she was unpacking like all of these horror stories of things that had happened to her in the industry already. And she had gone into it because she heard a story when she was like 12 or 13 years old, Jenna Jameson's, glamour success story of being in porn. And she said that inspired her, thinking this is how I'll achieve empowerment, is going into the porn industry. But she had been completely destroyed, mistreated, all this stuff. And so at the end of it, I really didn't even know like where to take the interview. And just this question came out of me. And I said, like, what is it that you really want in life? And she was from New Jersey, so she was very like, the
Yeah.
whole time had this kind of exterior about her, like, and even to something that you said earlier, I think for people that do suffer these kinds of things, they don't want to identify as a victim. And in our culture, we use the term victim in a pejorative way to associate it with something negative. But I
Yeah.
think there's a big difference between somebody who has been victimized versus taking on the identity of a victim. There's a big difference between those things.
Right.
And and um and so, but in her experience, not wanting to take on that identity of a victim had this kind of like thick exterior about her. So I said, what is it you really want in life? And she tried to like gather herself, like tears started welling up in her eyes, and she says, and she kind of like just broke, and she's like, I just want to be loved. And she kind of like talked through that for a few moments, and she's like, no one has ever even brought me flowers. And so 2 days later, we get a phone call from her, and she's in the hospital from something that had happened and related to her performing in porn. And she called us because we were the only people that she felt like she could call. I'm like, I just met
Wow.
you like 2 days ago. I'm like, and like, but that's the kind of predatory industry that the porn industry is. Like, she had to get a taxi to go to the hospital. And so so in that moment, we were able to buy her flowers and bring them to her in the hospital, and but the agenda, like, I think when people realize that you're an authentic human being, and you are interested in their good, and you don't have any other agenda other than to love well, I think people are able to open up. And what I noticed is that with her, she was able and to cross this personal threshold of reclaiming her own dignity, because everyone had related to her based on her sexuality, and
Right.
and 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 so it cast her into conforming into this sex object. And our sexuality is great, it's a part of who we are, but it's not the entirety of who we are.
Absolutely.
And so for us to be able to look past that and to access her humanity brought about a self-revelation in which she was able to cross a personal threshold and realize, no, I am human,
Mm.
and reclaim her dignity. And then after that, it was like I can't go back to porn. And she ended up like moving back to New Jersey. Like, I can't go back into a context of dehumanization after I've encountered the truth of my own humanity.
Right.
And so I love, the story that you shared. And I think I resonate with that, of just being able to let that pressure off of having to have some kind of agenda other than to love well, and having the courage to be willing to go into a situation, where we can just be present with somebody. And there's something powerful about being able to look into somebody's eyes and to see their humanity, that human to human connection, in a culture that is so dehumanizing. And so, yeah, I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Two kind of things came into my mind. One being how I first stumbled into you, which is so interesting how God like brings people together. And I I've always known about human sex trafficking, but I'll say my little sister is way more of a social like warrior. She really knows about causes that are going on in the world. And she briefly mentioned it one day, saying like, oh, Miami has like really high human sex trafficking rates. And I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't know what that meant. I started seeing like billboards, and like, like trafficking, and Hillsong does this huge walk every year with like X's on her mouth and things like that. I just wasn't aware of it. But when I walk home by myself, I always think to myself, Liz, be very aware of where you're walking. You're walking up a weird hill. And I walk with almost like terrorizing panic.
Mhm.
because I'm like, what if a van pulls up and just like grabs you? Like, and then I started realizing like this is actually a thing. Like this is not just this crazy notion of paranoia. Like, no, this is actually a thing. And I got an email from change.org, and I actually looked back at the email today, and that's when I first discovered you, because it said trafficking hub.
Oh yeah,
And that's the first time I realized like what was going on. And so when I read the email about it saying how Pornhub has, you know, these victims' video on line, I was completely shocked, because
yeah.
this was completely new to me, a completely new idea to me.
Mhm.
And then I became obsessed with figuring out more about that. I go, wait, is this actually like a thing? Like, what do you mean? And then I found you and on Instagram, and I just started kind of like looking at all of your content, and listening to, like, just looking at the videos and the things that you were posting. And that's why I was like, these are the kind of people I want to talk to. Like, these are the conversations I want to have.
Exactly.
So can you talk a little bit about that, like the trafficking hub, and
Yeah.
um, and even just to encourage some of our listeners to sign that petition. I went back and made sure that I signed it. I signed it again today. I shared it on Facebook, and I'm definitely going to share it with my audience again. But can you tell us more about what that is?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for mentioning it, and I love how that campaign has like cross connected our paths. So after we did Nefarious, we did a follow up film to that that looks deeper at the underpinnings of our culture that fuel sexual exploitation, and that film is called Liberated: The New Sexual Revolution, and that is available on Netflix. And then after that, we started working on a documentary on the porn industry. So starting in 2012, I've been working on a documentary and a book about porn that addresses it from these two different angles. The human rights side of the human rights side of the equation, which deals with how porn is getting created. And so the human rights issues that are at work, the human rights crisis that exists inside the porn industry, how this content is getting made. Our documentary focuses on that issue, and it's extremely compelling. It's what I liken it to is like some people, you know, because pornography is a very controversial issue in our culture, and there are people who, you know, promote it and say this is, you know, something great and can enhance your relationships, and there are people who are fundamentally against it. And for our part, we have really tried to frame the conversation around pornography as more of an ethical issue
Right.
than and and looking specifically on like, okay, well, whether you agree or disagree with pornography generally, we should all care about how it's being created. And what I liken it to is chocolate, because some people will say, you know, dark chocolate, you know, probably the people who like it say it's good for you, have a little dark chocolate every day. And then other people say, you know, no, the sugar's bad for you or whatever, you know. And but I think we can all agree that if it's being made by child slave labor, which most of the main chocolate brands are, provably made by child slave labor in Africa,
Oh, I did not know
um,
that.
then then we can all agree like that's not good, you know. And
Yeah.
so like, so not I might not have a, you know, quote unquote moral conviction or health conviction about consuming chocolate, but if it's being made by child slave labor, then that's something that I don't want to participate in,
Right.
fueling. And so we really took that angle with the porn thing to go like, look, regardless of how you feel about this, the way it's getting created is on a backdrop of systematic coercion, and and is deeply concerning. And so so that is the direction that we took with this documentary. The book that we began to develop, this my colleague Lila, who's really spearheading this trafficking hub campaign, and I began to develop, is called the Triple X Factor. That's coming out in a couple of months, and it deals with the public health side of pornography. So the impact of pornography on the consumer, on relationships, on society. And it's a very research-based resource that is the most comprehensive analysis of pornography I think that's ever been done, and also that includes, it's a solutions-based approach to the problem the problem and the public health crisis of pornography. So it's both educational about the scope and impact of pornography and how to understand it and a systems level analysis, but also empowering from the standpoint of how we can heal from some of its effects in our personal lives and our relationships and so on. So public health, human rights. Well, what Lila discovered several months back in the fall of last year is the distribution side of pornography actually represents one of the most troubling aspects of this entire larger industry. And that is that the large tube sites, Pornhub being the most prominent and the most recognizable, don't have any kind of effective means to verify age or consent of videos that are being to their site. So they take kind of like a YouTube model where anybody can upload content. Well, the problem is that they're not verifying the age or consent of people in the videos that are being uploaded to their site. And so there was a study done by the Times, there was a study done by Vice, there was a study done by the BBC. My own colleague Lila, which has really been at the spearhead of this, did a deep dive, investigative journalistic kind of dive into discovering this whole world of Pornhub, and the information now that's coming out is that there are dozens and dozens, hundreds of stories, verifiable cases of people who were victims of rape, victims of child sex trafficking, human trafficking, who the videos of the crimes being committed against them were on Pornhub, and some of them for years with millions of views. Jesus. And so it has galvanized this whole kind of awakening about the reality of what Pornhub actually is and the content that's actually on it. And so it is infested with videos that are of people's actual sexual exploitation. And so my colleague Lila started a petition, and we started a new website called traffickinghub.com, where we basically tell the story. There's a lot more detail to it that people can find on traffickinghub.com. But yeah, it's been picked up by well over 200 news outlets now. We have more than 200 partner organizations that are partnered with us in this. We're over 800,000 signatures now on the petition. Wow. And we are making a push to hold Pornhub accountable for and their executives accountable for abetting human trafficking on their website and being complicit in profiting off of the exploitation of other people. And so, so we encourage people in signing and sharing the petition to go to traffickinghub.com. And just one other note that I'll make is that a lot of people have gone, when you go onto the actual petition that's through change.org, which you can access on traffickinghub.com, there are all kinds of donor prompts that pop up, and a lot of people have mistakenly donated. Those who go to change.org, mistakenly donated change.org, thinking that they were donating to our campaign. And I just want to, and so I just want to put that disclaimer out there that if people actually want to support this campaign, to do it through the traffickinghub.com link. There's two links, one to sign the petition, one to contribute if people would be interested in that. But it is, in 2012, we talked about dispatching this armada against the porn industry, the kind of like larger impact of porn on our world. And so what we've said in this year is that we have the great porn wars of 2020 have begun, and we amassing an army of people to participate in slaying this Goliath that has committed such egregious crimes.
Wow. Amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. That's amazing. And I'm going to make sure I reshare that again with the traffickinghub.com and with my audience. And just on the podcast, I'll put it in the link below so that way people can click on it and sign that petition just get more involved. So now, because I know that your company is called Exodus Cry. So I know one of the stories that you shared on the Nations podcast is that you went to Canada, which I found really interesting, because when I first started listening to the podcast, what I started thinking was, what about Canada? I remember going to Canada one time and flipping the magazines in the back and seeing all this prostitution, and my family being like, oh yeah, prostitution's legal here. And I thought that was super weird, like in my eyes. And some of my family members jokingly were like, oh, but that's awesome. Like, it's women's body, like it's empowering, like they should have that. The state should have that. So can you talk about when you guys went to Canada and when they were trying to, what was it? They were trying to pretty much legalize brothels.
Yeah, I can talk about that. Yeah. So yeah, the way to understand how the battle lines are being drawn up right now over the issue of human trafficking have to do with kind of like two different views and definitions of prostitution, and then how legislation is guiding nations in dealing with this. And so on one hand, you have the abolition movement that is advocating for legislation that decriminalizes the individuals being sold for sex, predominantly women, but criminalizes and holds accountable the pimps, traffickers, johns, etc. And so in countries like Sweden, where this was first passed, we've seen that this legislation, which is, some refer to it as the Nordic model, some refer to it as the equality model, I refer to it as the abolition model. This has eradicated sex trafficking in Sweden. On the other side of the equation, you have the quote unquote pro-sex work movement that is funded largely by the Open Society Foundation, funded by George Soros. It's his foundation, and others, but it's a well-funded global movement pushing for a definition of prostitution that says this is sexually liberating, this is empowering, and if we just fully decriminalize it, including pimps, brothel owners, johns, etc., that all the harm that is inherent to this system of the commercial sex industry will magically be expunged, and it'll and so these two movements are really at odds. But the fact is anywhere where the sex industry has been expanded mostly by virtue of the success of the pro-sex work movement. I say success, but their push to fully decriminalize, anywhere where that has actually happened, has increased trafficking and increased sexual exploitation. And so Canada was in this they were in this place of wrestling with these issues, and there was a big push to fully decriminalize prostitution in Canada. And so we went up there, we met with their parliament, we screamed nefarious to them. They decided to push pause on their plans to fully decriminalize prostitution, where we would have seen all kinds of brothels popping up, and they took a year. They said, we're going to look into this. They researched our claims about the inherent harms of prostitution and our view that prostitution is a system of violence, exploitation, and gender inequality. And they came back a year later, and all of their findings confirmed what we had shared with them. And so they ended up doing a 180-degree turn, passing the Nordic model. And for us, that is a very palpable victory over this system of injustice. And so when we look out at the nations, we feel like the roadmap towards a path for freedom and towards a path for justice is clear, that we have to shift mindsets and pass this legislation that can eradicate sex trafficking. As abolitionists, we fundamentally reject the term sex work. Prostitution happens on the basis of a lack of desire. So we reject the term sex work because we don't believe that sex can be work. Sex and desire are uniquely and inextricably linked, and sex without desire is violation and exploitation, regardless if somebody is getting paid for it. And so a better way to understand prostitution as paid sexual coercion or paid sexual abuse. If you have two people who come into a room, the John the sex buyer and the woman who's being sold for sex, he puts the money on the table and he says, you can take the money or leave, or you can stay for the sex. 10 times out of 10, she's going to take the money and leave. Why? Because she doesn't desire him, and she doesn't desire his fantasies, and she doesn't desire the man after him and the man after him and their strange fantasies, the 10 to 15 to 30 men a day. She doesn't desire them. By virtue of that, she experiences the sex as a form of sexual abuse. And so I think it's a very cynical and cruel notion that we would call this a job. I mean, what other job are the vast majority of people raped in the job? What other job is the experience of sexual harassment fundamental to the job? What other job do 68% of the people experience PTSD and trauma? And so we abolitionists do not subscribe to the belief that sex can be work. We do not subscribe to the belief that this is a job like any other, that there's anything empowering about it. The entire sex industry exists as a construct of male demand. It is fundamentally one of the major pillars of inequality left in our world. And we would say, well, stop telling women what to, they say, don't tell women what to do with their bodies. They say that to us. And I'm like, it's ironic because abolitionists are actually the ones telling pimps, traffickers, Johns not to do with women's bodies. And we are advocating for the decriminalization of the women. And so, but anyhow, yeah, so the situation of prostitution itself is one in which the person is experiencing the sex as a form of sexual abuse because they don't desire, and by virtue of that has to dissociate. And so people will talk about, well, I don't let him kiss me, or I don't let him touch my arm, or these various things where they can house their humanity as they endure the experience of prostitution in order to survive that experience. And but at the same time having to fracture their humanity to endure it. And so, so the entire system of prostitution, the entire global commercial sex industry is a system of violence, exploitation, and gender inequality. One of the most egregious manifestations of injustice in the commercial sex industry is sex trafficking. So, but it's a mistake to say that just this one area of sex trafficking, which really defines the way that somebody is brought into prostitution. Other people are coerced into it by virtue of poverty, by virtue of statelessness, by virtue of other vulnerabilities, by being a part of a marginalized group, like being a Native American or some type of racial marginalization, poverty, and they're brought into it in different ways. But when we use this term that just sex trafficking is what we care about, we're really defining out worthy versus unworthy victim. The fact is that regardless of how somebody got in the system, the entire system operates as a system of violence, exploitation, and gender inequality. So abolitionists stand against that, and we are fighting to shift mindsets and change laws around the world to eradicate this injustice.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I was going to say, I think what's important to say is, what is sex trafficking, right? So before I watched the documentary, I didn't really understand how the process works. So we say sex trafficking or human trafficking, and I don't think people understand the severity of how it actually happens. I know because it's definitely happening within the States, but also how is it happening in places like Cambodia or what's the first one? Meladon? The first
Moldova.
one? Moldova. Say it one more time. Moldova. Yeah. So can you explain the process of, I know in Cambodia, the parents are usually the ones that are giving their children up for sex work. And then in Moldova, it's more of just because of poverty and because of the fact that they were orphans at one point and no one really cares for them and no one really knows what's happening. Mm-hmm. So can you explain a little bit just to people that are listening that don't really understand how does this happen and how it's kind of happening in different places? And obviously I wouldn't just recommend them to watch your documentary, but can you just explain that to them that are listening and they're kind of just unaware of how does it even happen?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, and so I'll give some thoughts on this, and then unfortunately I'll
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
have to run after that. But yeah, who knows? Maybe we can set up another conversation down the road to, because it's quite a rabbit hole to go down, which is why we made Liberated, or which is why we went on to this porn doc. So there's layers to this,
Right.
and so prostitution and sex trafficking really has to be understood in the larger context of our world and the facilitating culture that we live in, that is sending large demographics of the population into this system of violence and exploitation. But one, I think, important thing for people to understand about sex trafficking is that it has different faces in different parts of the world. And so what it looks like in Brazil is different than what it looks like in Vegas, is different what it looks like in Tijuana, it's different what it looks like in Moldova, it's different what it looks like in Bangkok, and it's different than it looks like in Cambodia. And so there's different faces to trafficking. Shared Hope International did a study, I believe it was Shared Hope International did a study in which they identified 25 faces of human trafficking. It's like the most common kind of faces of trafficking. So there's different faces of it around the world. And then there are commonalities, as well. But yeah, like you mentioned, in Moldova, there was a massive social orphan crisis, in which after the Iron Curtain of communism fell, and people were employed through that system and kind of like given, jobs to do. It was a country that was completely left to fend for themselves, and having been under kind of this system of tyrannical system of oppression, did not know how to fend for themselves. And so what happened is that all the parents fled the country looking for work abroad. And there was a massive social orphan crisis in which 300,000 children were left behind. And that's a massive number in a country of 4 million people. And so these children were literally just left. Well, this was a trafficker's paradise. Organized crime came in and began to target these children. A lot of them were just out fending for themselves. Some of them were orphans, and but traffickers learned how to target that vulnerability, to capture these children and bring them into prostitution. So what we learned, is that these children were being brought primarily through Belgrade, which they call the breaking grounds, and they were being put up in apartments, which would be, one apartment would be packed with a number of young women, 14, 16 years old, young Moldovans, and they would be what they call seasoned there to be used in prostitution. So they would be broken down, gang raped, all of these horrific things, and then be sold on, through auctions, black market auctions, and various means, sold on to pimps and brothel owners and so on and so forth, that would then be exploited in places like Amsterdam and Dubai and different places. And so you have source countries, and then you have destination countries. And that kind of is the situation going on, generally speaking, in Europe. In Southeast Asia, there's more of a cultural phenomenon specifically tied to the way in which young girls are valued in that culture. And there's kind of a cultural complicity in the selling and exploiting of children. And unfortunately, I don't have the time to fully unpack what's going on in Southeast Asia. But like you pointed out, one of the most egregious aspects of what's going on there is the situation in some of these villages, predominantly Vietnamese villages in Cambodia, but where parents are actually selling their children. And some of the villages, the number of parents selling their children is like 80 to 90%. And it makes this situation very challenging, because a John can come into town. He doesn't have to go to a brothel. A pimp can simply connect with him and then go to the parents' house, pay the parents, and then they take the child out and he goes with the John. It's mind-blowing at a level that is unfathomable. And so anyways, lots more to talk about, and maybe we can take
Yeah,
another
no,
stab at it another time. But I love your heart and the deep dive that you've enabled us to do on this podcast today for these past couple hours, and hopefully it's valuable to your listeners. So
oh,
thank you again for
absolutely,
having me.
Ben. Thank you so much. Where can the listeners connect with you?
So the Trafficking Hub right now is our campaign against Pornhub, traffickinghub.com. And And then our nonprofit organization, Exodus Cry, is exoduscry.com. People want to connect with me directly. I'm on Instagram, Benji Nolo. And then we have our film production company called Magic Lantern Pictures.
Yes.
So yeah, Magic Lantern Pictures, Trafficking Hub, Exodus Cry, Benji Nolo, any one of those. And
Yes.
kind of like,
and then they could check out the documentary on YouTube, and then
yeah, we just released Nefarious on YouTube, so that's great. It's our Exodus Cry YouTube channel, and the entire film is available there, as well as a bunch of other videos and resources. So yeah, so hopefully people can check that out as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate
Yeah,
your
thank
time.
you.